Okay, if we can have your attention, please, we're ready to start with the breakfast program for our Federal Affairs
Mike Chuck, hello,
Breakfast.
hello.
This has become an annual event here, so thank you again for getting up so early after a very long couple of days here, and thank you for being here. First, we'd like to thank our sponsor, which is GEI Consultants. So if you give them a big hand, they help keep things affordable here for us. So. With that, thank you very much. We're ready to start with our program. We're going to turn it over to our chair of our Federal Affairs Committee from Colorado Springs Utilities. It is Andy Colosimo. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Doug, and thank you for all your hard work on pulling this convention together. This takes a lot of teamwork. So, well, good morning, everybody. Doug asked me to cover a multitude of things this morning before our speaker comes on, including all the bills that we're tracking at the federal level. But I said, no, I'm just going to keep it kind of short and sweet. And I know, he wanted me to list all the HR bills, all the Senate bills, and I thought, no. So we decided to keep it kind of very brief. Just wanted to recognize the Federal Affairs team for Water Congress, and I chair it. Chris Treese is the co-chair, and Christine is our fearless leader of all federal affairs. She's our liaison to the board and our liaison to NWRA, the National Water Resources Association. That's our federal trade association. And Christine chairs our Federal Affairs Committee. Chris Treese, Chris Piper from Denver Water, and myself all serve on the NWRA board. And so I think the NWRA, our presence in Washington, D.C. has been very, very effective the past couple of years. I think we're really getting a strong voice there. And I'd like to also thank Ian Lyle from NWRA. I think he's sitting over here at one of the tables. He is our on-the-ground lobbyist in D.C. for NWRA, and so we really appreciate all of his hard work. He's a Colorado kid, and so spent some time working on the Hill, and so we're very, very lucky to have him now working on our behalf. So I also just want to quickly thank the congressional offices that have been with us through this program. From Senator Bennett's office, we have Marian Whitman, John Whitney, and Noah Kepperman, all over here at this table. And from Senator Gardner's office, Phil Newman. And from Congressman Tipton's office, Brian Meinhardt. So thank you all of them for taking some time out of their day and to learn a little bit more firsthand about what Water Congress is up to and to spend some time. I know they've had a lot of meetings with many of you, so we really appreciate their taking some time out of their schedule to be here. So just quickly on some of the priority things that we're going to be working on. We have a list of about 20, and I really don't want to cover all of them, but the drought bill, if and when Congress can work on a drought bill, that's going to be our top priority. Waters of the United States is keeping up our good presence on that issue that Mark Pfeiffer and others have been able to move forward. Re-added our Good Samaritan legislation back to the list, and so appreciate the leadership of our congressional offices on trying to push that issue again, and water transfer rule. So those are just a couple of things that we're going to be on the ground engaged on in D.C. The website has all kinds of great information, and thanks to the Water Congress staff for updating that, for our priorities, our Federal Affairs Committee calls, and our access to NWRA work program. So with that, I want to turn it over to Christine to introduce our breakfast speaker. So thank you.
Good morning. I'd also like to add that Ben Stein from Congressman Kaufman's office has joined us today as well. So, thank you, Ben, for coming. So, we all know that this conference has just been so big, so many people, and so many new faces, and that means new ideas and more diverse points of view. Those of you who've been coming as long as I have know that we probably needed a good infusion of different perspectives over the years. But it exposes the need to not only tolerate different points of view, but to give them really due and serious consideration. So as Andy said, the way familiar faces of your federal affairs team decided that we needed to offer a different point of view for this morning's talk about federal affairs as well. So we have with us today Bob Szabo, who, like most advocates in Washington, D.C., started out as a young staffer on Capitol Hill. He worked for a very powerful, very effective chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, Bennett Johnston from Louisiana, which is where Bob is from. That was at a time when Congress functioned much differently, and Bob's going to talk about that and the dynamic of Washington, D.C. Today. He is currently the Van Ness Feldman Law Firm's coordinating partner for policy strategy, and he was on the forefront of the creation of NESARC, which many of you are a member of, National Endangered Species Reform Coalition. We asked Bob to speak to you today about the way Washington works or doesn't. And we chose Bob because he's insightful, he's very frank, and he has great perspective on what good government is and good governance is. He's not driven by hardline ideologies, but by experience that includes a time when Washington operated in a much, much different way. So I think you'll find Bob far more interesting than a lengthy report from the rest of us.
Christine, thank you, and Andrew, thank you and Chris for allowing me to come, and Doug, who's got his Hawaiian shirt on and not here at the moment. I think there was one other attribute about me that made me the candidate this morning, and that is I'm expendable. So I hope to get through this conversation without making mortal enemies of anyone. I think the chances of that are probably difficult in this partisan atmosphere in which we live. But what I want to do is, Christine asked me to talk about how Congress is working. I am no expert on that, but I think what I can offer you, and hopefully it'll be of some use, is kind of how I found Washington 40 years ago when I arrived as a young staffer. Some headwinds that I think Congress encounters and has encountered in that last 40 years. Many of them imposed by the electorate, some imposed by themselves, and how that informs maybe the way to work to try to achieve policy, and how this 114th Congress is doing. So that's what I intend to do in the next few minutes. Do we have my PowerPoint, or? Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. Can you see that over there? Okay. So let me see if I can make it work. All right, so when I arrived in Washington in November of 1975 to work for Bennett Johnston, he was not yet a powerful chairman of the Energy Committee. He was in his third year, junior senator to the senior senator, Russell Long, son of Huey Long. I was 28, so now you know how old I am. I was practicing law in Baton Rouge, had my own shingle out, was not political. Didn't go to Washington to advance the cause of the Democratic Party, or didn't go with anything in mind but to have an interesting experience, figure out how Washington worked, and go back home. And obviously I didn't go back home. In fact, just to show you how presumptuous I was, I sent out announcement cards to all the other attorneys in Baton Rouge saying I was taking a 3-year leave of absence and I would be back and resume my practice. You know, young, enthusiastic guy, I thought people actually cared. You know, I thought you should do that. But now I know probably nobody cared. So I arrived in Washington, and I was on the staff of Senator Johnston, and I found a Congress that was very collegial. Democrats had controlled the Senate since 1955. There were, Gerald Ford was president. If you remember, Gerald Ford is the probably maybe will always be the only president we've ever had that never was elected in a national election. It was shortly after Watergate. Watergate had destroyed the Republican Party electorally. in the elections. Spiro Agnew, the elected vice president, I don't know if he'd been convicted yet, but he had been indicted for bribery, so he was removed as vice president. Gerald Ford was appointed, and then Richard Nixon resigned, and then Gerald Ford appointed Governor Rockefeller as his vice president. So for the only time in the history of our country, we had a president and vice president, neither of whom had run for national office. You had 61 Democrats in the Senate. You had 150 vote margin of Democrats in the House. And so that was the legislative situation. We were about 2 years into the Arab oil embargo. We were in a recession. We were experiencing energy shortages around the country. I might tell you that I was surprised to find that out coming from Louisiana. We didn't have any energy shortages. But the nation was beginning to focus on energy. And most senators and most House members brought their families to Washington. They lived in Washington. The work week was 5 days. Congress was in session for 5 days, sometimes on the weekend, and they would take a week off. Senators, there was a room set aside for senators for lunch. They had 2 big tables, and senators of both parties would go in there and eat lunch together and talk to each other. And they got to know each other, and they got to create relationships, and they got to bridge gaps. And that room is closed now. They don't do that anymore, and they haven't done that for some time. But with all of this interaction that was occurring, there was a great middle in the Senate. The South was still Democratic. The West had a lot of Democratic members. The Northeast and Midwestern Republicans there were moderates among them, and so there was a great middle made up of conservative to moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans. And so stuff got done. And since that time, Congress has really encountered some headwinds. And I want to talk about those headwinds. I think we're all familiar with this, extreme partisanship. We have come to a place of extreme partisanship. If you hear Charlie Cook or other political observers talk, they talk about, and political scientists talk, they talk about the sorting out of the people into the 2 parties based on philosophical orientation. And so Democrats today are much more committed to whatever it is they see in the Democratic Party. Republicans today are much more committed to what they see in the Republican Party. And they, I think something a little bit different from when I was up working in the Senate, is they are suspicious of the other party. And that extends to people, in this room. How can a Democrat have any sense when it comes to natural resources? How can Republicans care about social issues? And so we've kind of, as a nation, drawn into our little tribes. Members don't bring their families to Washington anymore. The work week is like Tuesday through Thursday. Another factor that I didn't put on my slides, and I should have, is that campaigns have become enormously expensive. There are cases today of some Senate seats. You might raise $50, $75, $100 million for those Senate races. House races that were maybe $300,000, $400,000 when I worked up on the Hill 40 years ago are now $4 or $5 million. So members are in a constant fundraising mode. And members also understand if you're going to raise that kind of money, you better be in the heart of your team. You better have your jersey on, and you better be, you can't be on the fringes of your team, or you're not going to get that money that your team can generate. And so you find a hardening of positions for the very fact that people have to raise money to be reelected. And even when folks are in Washington, one of the reasons they don't have lunches together anymore is they're at fundraisers. you're in a constant fundraising mode if you're a senator or a House member. And frankly, when I was up there, senators kind of, for 4 years, they didn't do too much, and for the last 2 years, they were in an abject panic. House members kind of ran all the time and kind of had it under control. But the idea of senators now kind of taking it easy for 4 years, learning their way around the Senate, the moment you're elected, you start raising money for the next election. The other thing that's happening a lot is we gerrymandered the House districts. So basically the two parties have carved out their seats. Not many are up for grabs in any election. And the House doesn't turn over as much as it once did. Well, as the founders thought it should. Now it's the Senate that turns over, and I want to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So extreme partisanship has really made it difficult, and it's extended to the point that I know of cases where the leadership of the two parties in the House or the Senate, I don't want to say discipline is too harsh a word, but they've talked roughly to members of their caucus who try to work with members of the other team to try to figure out a solution different from what the leadership is offering. And so there's active discouragement of working across the lines, or there have been examples of that in the last 40 years. So partisanship. Now your state's a little bit different. You are a bipartisan state. Now I don't know what's going to happen in the next election, but right now you're about as perfectly bipartisan as a state can be. You've got a senator of each party. I think, what do you have, four Republican members and 3 Democratic members, or vice versa? Can't get to that half member, so you're about as perfectly bipartisan as you can be. Now, forget politics, forget what your heart tells you. From a policy position, to be able to get what you need for your state, that's a perfect position. You've got somebody to work with in both parties. And that's a good thing. Some states are all blue or they're all red, and it's more difficult. How do you work? If you're all red, how do you work with this administration? If you're all blue, what happens if you don't have a Democrat in the White House? So I'm an advocate of bipartisanship. I like purple states, and I think that puts you in a good place to try to get good public policy. The middle has almost disappeared. All those Southern Democrats are gone in the Senate, most of them. The South is now red, all Republican. There are not many people in the middle. There are 54 Republican senators, and they struggle to find 6 Democrats who will vote with them when they need to get to 60. There just aren't many folks left in the middle. If you look over at the House side, I think you're all familiar with the Blue Dog Democrats that were the conservative Democrats that had a pretty good run for a while. They got up to 58 members, I think. Well, they're now down to 15 members. And the reality politically is if you're in the middle, if you're elected kind of from the middle, you're easy pickings for the other party. And so if you represent a district as a Democrat, and it's a pretty middle-of-the-road district, you're going to be you have a pretty high chance of losing to a Republican. Democrats have beaten most of the Republicans in the Northeast. And so we have our two parties have gone more to their extremes. The Republican Party is getting more conservative, partly because of the primary challenges that happen. If you're not conservative enough, you're going to pick up a challenger in your Republican district. And Democrats haven't sat back and said, oh, you know, the Republicans are moving right, let's move to the middle. They're moving to the left. So as the two parties move further away, there's less common ground, or at least they perceive less common ground. And that's a big, big problem. I think we have different public expectations of our members. You know, I think when I went to Washington, people didn't think about Congress too much. We didn't have cable news. We didn't have Fox News. Proceedings in the Senate weren't on television. Nothing was. I don't think proceedings in the House were on television. We didn't have the internet. If you wanted to know what was going on, you were a staffer. You got there early to get the congressional record before anybody else got it and thumbed through it to figure out what was happening. Seems like the antediluvial days, but we didn't have 550 cable channels. We didn't have Fox News. We didn't have C-SPAN. We didn't have CNN. We didn't have MSNBC. And now you have this flood of information that's coming in from, and they're filling up airtime, and they're underscoring, from their perspectives, what they don't like that's going on in Congress. So now Congress is thought about all the time. And I think back when I went, people sort of said, well, you know, the Congress is up there. We trust these people we elected to go do the right thing. Unless they make some big mistake, we're happy with them. I think for both parties now, the electorates of both parties, they want you to go up there and solve problems the way they want you to solve problems. And often it's safer just not to solve the problem. Keep the issue alive rather than take a chance of reaching a compromise that isn't acceptable to your base. One of the things I learned when I was a young staffer is that my boss, in his third year as a senator, voted on an issue that was hot in the day, and he voted in a way that I knew he didn't intellectually agree with the way he voted. And I said, well, why did you vote that way? And he said, you know, when I first came, I voted my conscience on something, and it wasn't going to pass, but I said, you know, I'm going to vote that way. And he said, it took me 6 months to explain my vote repeatedly. Every time I was anywhere, I had to explain the vote. So he said, now I vote with my team. His team was the Southern Democrats. And I'm going to vote with my team until it gets to be a decisive vote, and then I'm going to go back and vote my conscience. I think a lot of that's going on too, because you're safe as long as you're voting with your team, and you're not as safe when you move out to try to do something a little bit different. So I think there's a different demand that people are making on their members of Congress. And I think frankly, I think we need to change that demand. Because we need to say, look, go up there and solve the problem, solve it the best way you can. You know why we elected you. Go see what kind of deal you can get, and let's get these problems solved. For a while, after the Republicans took over in 1995, and I'm not picking on the Republicans, the Democrats continued this in the House when they took over. When I worked up there, everything started at the committee level. You worked the committee chairman came up with a bill, you worked your amendments through the committee, and then the chairman would go try to get floor time, and that's kind of how the agenda was put together. Starting with DeLay, who was a majority leader, that changed. And the leadership started running the agenda of the House and Senate. And committee chairs were diminished in their importance. And after a while, lobbyists figured out that, well, wait a minute, if the leadership is going to make all the judgments, we'll work the leadership, forget the committee. And you see this happening even today. When Congress can't pass appropriation bills, can't pass legislation, they end up with an omnibus at the end of the year. The omnibus that was just negotiated at the end in December was the White House dealing with the Republican leadership in the House and Senate. Not even the Democrats on the Hill were always involved. And so a handful of people tend to put together a bill, meaning that everybody else is kind of left out. And I know in the last omnibus, some of the chairmen in the Senate weren't even always advised about what was going to go into the last package, and even though the issue was in their jurisdiction. So there's been a diminishment of the power of the committees and of the chairs. I believe I see signs that maybe we're going back to the older way and working from the committee up and making the committees more important. And that's important, because if you don't work the committees, that's where the education on issues, the institutional education, the institutional knowledge of the Congress resides. is in the members and staff of the committees of jurisdiction. If you skip that process, you don't have people on the Hill that really know the issues. The only people that know the issues are their counterparts in the executive branch. And if you don't control the executive branch, you're not going to like the results. If the Congress isn't able to get in there and negotiate and work out something that they can live with. I think now I'm going to talk about self-inflicted problems. And this I am a little critical of the Republicans. The Republicans, I'm sure for very good reasons, put 6-year limits on their chairmanships. And so if you're a ranking member, if the Democrats have the majority, or you're a chairman, if the Republicans have the majority, you have 6 years to be chairman of a committee. And then you have to rotate off. Now, I don't know all the details of exactly how the rule works, but it started in the House, and then it went to the Senate. Democrats haven't done this. I think this is a terrible rule, because when chairmen change, staff changes. And when chairmen change, agendas change. And so, and you all, somebody was telling me that they had worked 20 years to get a policy out of Congress or out of the federal government. Policies go beyond 6 years often. So when you restrict your leadership to 6 years, you have built in some instability and I think lack of knowledge. And I'm sure many Republicans agree with what I'm saying, but having gone there, you can't go back. You know, how can you take it back once you've done it? All the younger Republicans are saying, wait a minute, I'm about to become chairman. You can't change that rule now. But this was not a positive rule, and it does affect the way Congress works. The next thing that happened, again, I think a mistake, and Congress is trying to plow it back slowly, is earmarks were done away with. And this was where your member of Congress could get in there and maybe make sure that money came to your project, which is one of the reasons we send our people to Congress, bring home the bacon. Well, when you take away earmarks, that sounds like a good government thing, but all you've done is empowered the executive branch. Now they make the judgments about where the money goes. And while I think Congress realizes this was not a good thing, and they would like to take it back, it'll take a while to get it back. And now, if you want money out of Congress, you have to work the executive branch as hard as you work your member of Congress. You just can't go say to one of your congressmen, hey, I need $20 million for the water district, and can you get in there and get us $20 million? That doesn't work that way anymore. So that has diminished the power of Congress. Apparently I have to point it too. All right, so the other thing that's kind of a new phenomenon is that the Senate has turned over rapidly. For all kind of reasons, I don't know all the reasons, but things that happened. The Democrats controlled the Senate from 1955 to 1981. What is that, 26 years, if my math is correct. Then the Republicans, Reagan Revolution, 13 Democratic senators were defeated when he was elected. I think many of them, surprisingly, you know, that's kind of like a bolt out of the blue. So the Republicans took over the control of the Senate, and they had it from 81 to 86. And then back to Democratic control, back to Republican control. There was one Congress where it started out as a Republican Congress, and one of the members switched parties, or at least became an independent, and caucused with the Democrats, and the Republican lost the control of the Senate, and like 2 months into the Congress, a very unusual happening. And then when you've seen it go back and forth. Now, here's what's fascinating. In this election, there are 24 Republicans up for re-election. There are 10 Democrats. Now, who knows what's going to happen? But with the Republicans having a 4-vote margin in the Senate, unless they win the presidency, you say, okay, well, maybe the Democrats can get 4 seats. But then if you look at 2018, there are 23 Democrats up for election and 8 Republicans up for election. Well, you got to think maybe it goes back the other way. And then in 2020, you got 22 Republicans up for election and 11 Democrats up for election. Folks, this is the definition of instability. So we have the possibility of swings. Now, maybe the Republicans will retain the Senate. Maybe this won't happen. But this is what we, the people, have done and have sent to Congress and have said, now, be effective in light of all this change that we're sending you. So I think we are the people, this is our Congress, and we're the people who are creating some of these headwinds. And maybe this will level out after a while and more stability. The House doesn't flip because of the gerrymandering. And if you remember, the forefathers thought the House would flip rapidly to reflect the view of the people, and the Senate was supposed to be the stable, not change very often body. And it's not working that way right now. So what's important about this? I think what's important about this is more so than ever, we need bipartisan strategies if you're trying to achieve a policy. More than ever, we can't work just with our friends. Listen, I'm a Democrat. I can tell you Democrats are tough on natural resources issues. As they become more of an urban party and a suburban party, they just don't understand or care that much about natural resources issues. They're tough on energy. Republicans don't want to admit that carbon is a problem when you burn fossil fuels. Democrats don't want to use fossil fuels. They just say we can have solar and wind and not have fossil fuels. Neither position is correct. The position that we are more comfortable with, I am, is a Republican position. But you got to work with the Democrats on these kind of issues. You got to work with a party that doesn't agree with you, with members that don't agree with you. And that's a hard thing to do. It's hard to mount a strategy where part of it depends on you convincing somebody that's not with you that they need to be with you. They need to be with you for reasons that are important to them and what they're trying to achieve. So I see more and more people just lobbying their friends, and it doesn't work that way. I think you need to start sooner with strategies. Takes longer. Work with more people. The changing of the party control, the changing of chairmanships, it means that these things take longer. And finally, you need to engage both the Congress and the executive branch. You might really not want to work with the executive branch, but you got to be sure the executive branch isn't there at the last minute tripping you up if you've convinced Congress to do something. And it always comes down to an opportunity when the executive branch, doesn't matter who's controlling it, can put their foot out at the last minute and trip up a policy on the way to the finish line. I would also say this, beware of single party strategies. I was talking to somebody this week. Their industry has got an issue. They have a hard time with Democrats. So they have a Republican-only strategy, which is fine if you want to stop something, but it's not fine if you want to get something. So, and let me just reacquaint you with some math that we all know, because Washington is about math. If you have a Republican president and you have a Republican House, and I think most of us think there'll be a Republican House at the end of this election, you need 60 Republican senators to stop a filibuster. Well, there are 54 Republican senators now. And just how many times has there been 60 senators of one party in the Senate? In the 40 years I've been in Washington, that's 3 times. And they've always been Democrats. So when you are thinking about a strategy, think about that. With 23 or 4 members up this year, to get to 60, you need 6 more Republicans. I'm just assuming for a minute that if you're a Republican, you all vote the same. We know that's not true either, that you got to have 60 people that vote the same way. I know you can pick up a couple of Democrats. You used to be able to pick them up, but there are less people in the middle now, so there are less people to go pick up. If you have a member of the opposition party who's the president and the Congress is in the hands of the other party, then 67 is your magic number, because you can have 60 members, you can get your 60 votes. It means nothing because the president can veto the bill, and then you need 67 votes, and you need 2/3 of the House. I'm just presuming you'll have 2/3 of the House. So be careful as you put together your strategy. You're going to need some people of both parties that are ready to stand with you, or you're not going to succeed. Now, you can stop something. Easiest thing in the world is to stop Congress from doing something. People get paid a lot of money to do that. It's almost wasted money. Congress can often stop itself. But if you want to achieve something, that's the side I'm talking about. You've got to work it. You've got to have people ready to stand up and be accounted for. This new phenomenon of the president saying, okay, well, I can't work with Congress, I'll just issue all these executive orders. I think presidents have done that. This president may or may not be doing it more often. He's certainly doing it on a lot of high-profile issues. Republicans squawk. They can't stop it because they can't get something through Congress. He won't veto that puts them into 67 votes, which they can't get. Future presidents are not going to forget what they've learned under the Obama administration. So I would expect presidents to continue to use their executive power. They have before Obama, they will after Obama, and that's one of the reasons you have to work with the executive branch as well as the Congress. So, what about this Congress, really quickly? Well, there was a flurry of activity at the end of 2014 that maybe some of us didn't expect. You had the Speaker Boehner resigning. You then had 3 major bills passed in November, December, and a lot of those bills were all bipartisan, and they contained a lot of bipartisan legislation as part of the package. One was the omnibus budget bill that basically Boehner delivered with Democratic votes to resolve a lot of issues through the election. Then there was the highway bill, which had a lot of good stuff in it. And then there was the omnibus appropriation bill, which was Speaker Ryan's first legislative achievement. What to expect this year? We have a bipartisan energy bill developed by the committee on the floor of the Senate. It's already passed the House. A similar bill has passed the House. It'll be debated for the next 2 or 3 weeks. One of the things different about this Senate, now that the Republicans took it back, is they vote. Majority Leader Reid prevented votes except where the president needed a vote. My friend Mary Landrieu, the Democratic senator in Louisiana, was defeated because she only got to vote on things the president wanted, and so she had a 97% voting record supporting the president. If she had been allowed to vote on everything she wanted to vote on, she might have had a 70% voting record. And so what was the tagline that got her defeated? Mary Landrieu supports Barack Obama 97% of the time. A strategy that backfired, I think, and hopefully people won't go there again. They'll let people vote. And senators and House members, you got to depend that they know how to vote on issues. They know their people. They know what they can vote on. They know how to vote. Let them vote. That's why they're there. So what might happen this year is bipartisan criminal justice reform. There's talk of that. There's desire in both parties. Maybe they'll get together. Then I don't think, this is just me, there'll be that much that passes because we'll be in the political system, in the political season. Then I think you'll have an omnibus bill after the election. So if you have a policy that you need to get, I think your game is to get ready to try to get into the omnibus bill after the election. So those are my thoughts. These are just my thoughts, so if you hate the thoughts, don't hate Christine or Andy or Doug, hate me. I don't offer these thoughts as any indication that I have any brilliance or insight. This is just my observation after having watched this for since I was 28, if I can imagine being 28. So how popular is Congress? Well, you know, Congress is not so popular. I looked up the Gallup polls, and in 2013, when we had the last government shutdown, the popularity of Congress dropped to, the approval rating dropped to 9%. And they are on a resurgence. They are back up to 17% last year. When there was a little fluff about shutting down the government again in November, when Boehner was resigning and all that, it dropped to 14%. I'm very happy to say today it's back to 16%. So Congress is making a comeback, and it's in our interest that Congress work and work effectively. So thank you very much, and if I have any time left and you want me to answer questions or attacks or personal assaults, anything, I'm right here.
We would like for you to take the opportunity to ask Bob questions. I was sitting here thinking that when you talk about what's gone wrong, what's changed with Congress, I had a conversation with a congressman, now retired congressman from Arizona, whose name I won't mention. And I said, "Are you missing being a member of Congress?" And he said, "No. I went there to throw grenades down the aisle, and I did it for 10 years, and I was happy to come home." And with that kind of attitude, it's just, I'm not saying that's the majority of Congress, but that kind of attitude about why you would go is part of why we have the dysfunction that we do, I think. So it's not about getting things done, it's about throwing grenades. It's frightening. So questions for Bob?
And members will throw grenades if you let them know that's what you want them to do. They are your representatives. If you say, don't throw grenades, try to find a way to work these problems out, they'll do that. But if they're rewarded for throwing grenades, they'll throw grenades. If they are punished for throwing grenades, they won't throw grenades.
So questions?
Time for about one question. We're actually running a little bit long, but any question?
Well, thank you very much for letting me speak.